lot of other disreputable things, writing for a lot of interesting tech companies and following the collision between Hollywood and technology. I've been doing it for a very long time, as you can tell from my very white hair. And this is a particularly fascinating project. The four people to my right are all members of Secret Location who have now come out of their Valhalla to talk about Halcyon. And it is a fascinating merger, and I think we will see a lot more of this stuff between VR and linear television. 10 episodes of linear TV, 5 of VR, running in 80 countries. For Sci-Fi International. As we will not really discuss, they can't tell you what's going on in the United States right now, but talks are proceeding apace. So I will let each of them introduce themselves and talk briefly about their role within the team, beginning with Sabrina.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Scocho, and I'm the supervising producer on Halcyon. And just regular production work trying to get a linear and VR project put together.
And I'm Stefan Grambart. I'm the creative director at Secret Location. I work out of our Toronto office. And so I guess I pitched the original creative concept and then worked heavily with Ben here, who will introduce himself shortly, on the creative direction and the look and feel and the story.
Yeah, so I'm Ben. I directed Halcyon, directed both the linear and the VR portions, but in a lot of ways this was kind of Steph and I being conjoined at the brain in figuring out how to do this.
Oh, so the Borg's already happening.
That's
This is
right.
fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, we've got Canadians and Americans,
That's
tech
right.
people in Hollywood. It's fantastic.
Resistance is futile.
Yeah.
And I'm the other American on the panel, I guess. So I'm Eric Shamlin. I'm managing director of the U.S. office for Secret Location. And I guess my primary role, at least for this job, is sort of heat shield or bullet shield, trying to let these people, these very talented teammates, pull off the magic that they do. So very honored to be here.
Well, let's start. I think the best place to begin is with the demo reel that they were trying to make work. Did we make that all function?
It should work. We'll see.
All right, so cross your fingers and pray to the technology gods that they are not mocking us. We can knock the lights down, that'd be great.
Yeah, let's see. All right.
And sound.
So we've got our sound problem again.
The video game, there's nothing else that's doing anything like this right now.
The story of Halcyon follows.
So it looks really nice. It's actually a silent movie. There's
Yes.
no sound.
But the
We're trying to
visuals
be
are awesome.
really arty with it.
We find out there's a murder.
Oh, I can hear it now.
Yeah.
Yeah, just put a mic to the computer. Like I said, you guys
The
didn't pray
story
enough
itself
to
is
tech
going to
gods.
really appeal to people who love a good plot, a good mystery, a good thriller. I don't understand.
Are creating a world.
It's going to be in between an interactive movie and a little bit of a video game. There's nothing else that's doing anything like this right now.
The story of Halcyon follows Julie Dover, who is a detective of virtual reality crime.
We're far enough in the future that something really interesting is happening, but not so far that we can't relate.
Halcyon is this large VR company. We find out there's a murder right at the start.
It's a murder that takes place in virtual reality that really shouldn't have happened in the first place.
The story itself is going to really appeal to people who love a good plot, a good mystery, a good...
Put on the Oculus Rift, run the headset, and you'll suddenly appear inside a 3D model of one of our key sets. There'll be a viewing room, which will mimic the hunting, and you'll be able to watch episodes on a large screen. It'll be like having a large screen. And will allow users to walk around and interact with objects.
This is 3D sound in action.
Explore and move around the world, interact with objects, you're picking up clues, physical objects, you're tracing fingerprints and helping the main characters solve the crime in the story.
Great. That glass had an intact, clear print. Perfect. So let's filter out all matching prints.
Halcyon is a hybrid series, which means that it's going to live on the web, in VR, and in front of broadcast. It's going to be broadcast on
Okay. Maybe we'll stop it there, and we'll talk about it so we can use our ears.
You guys
a
just
little
did not go to tech church, I can tell.
Yeah, that's right.
So what's interesting to me about this is it feels a little bit like super hyper fancy ARG, alternate reality kind of game that also is spilled into, again, linear TV. So is that sort of the roots of this ultimately, Stefan, since you're the boy genius who initially came up with the concept? Talk a little bit about how you conceptualized this.
Yeah. So from the original concept, we were just looking for something that was very digital first. So we knew that the content was going to work somehow with Sci-Fi International.
Pull the mic forward.
And also it would, would also have to be something that we wanted to do digitally. So we pitched a lot of ideas, and one of the ideas that we came up with, I came up with this tagline, "The scene is virtual, but the crime is real." And that was sort of just the genesis of that idea, that this was going to be not only a show that was going to be partially presented in VR, but also be about VR itself, so that somehow the medium that you're watching the content in is also the medium that we're talking about.
Okay. So as meta as we can make it is I guess
Exactly.
probably your motto, your meta motto. So you start from that component. It seemed like the VR part of this is actually more of a game-ish kind of experience. Is that safe to say in terms of, talk a little bit more, I mean, we've got a little tiny sense of it from the video there, but talk a little bit about that part of the process.
Yeah, it's we looked at how we were going to make this a little bit more interactive than some of the other VR pieces we had done previous to this one. So we had started with Sleepy Hollow, which we had done for Fox Television, and that was...
You lost your head over that, I understand. So.
Getting your head chopped off in VR, spoiler alert. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to involve the audience a bit more, because we knew that this was one of the things that virtual reality does really well. It gives the audience some agency within that story. But we also didn't want to go too far. I mean, we talk about VR a lot at the shop, and I mean, not just for work, but also on lunch breaks and around the water cooler. So we have all these great ideas and all these theories about where VR can go in the next 5 years. But what we wanted to focus on was something that was realistically achievable, not only within the timeline and the pipeline, but also something that the audience could digest. It's one of the reasons that we chose the idea of a police procedural as our genre, because it's something that's easily recognizable. All the pieces of it, all the accoutrements of a police procedural is something that you would be able to pick up very easily, even though it's coming at you in a very different medium.
Okay, so a police procedural, and obviously you have a slogan there that's worthy of CBS in their police procedurals. But then it comes the next sort of step here, and I want to talk particularly to Sabrina and Ben about the process of creation. On the one hand, Sabrina, as supervising producer, you have perhaps the most thankless task in entertainment history here, trying to do not one but two mediums and actually make it all come together. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that. And then Ben, from your standpoint as a director, the differences between directing in VR and directing in linear. So Sabrina, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah. So I think like the one thing that's really important about Halcyon is that we wanted to make sure that it was integrated, like the VR was actually integrated into the story arc. So it's the first ever VR series that actually alternates episodes with the linear episodes. So
you have to watch both to have the whole experience.
You don't have to, because we recap, and not in like an annoying way, like this is what happened last week kind of thing. It's built into the story. So you can watch just the linear episodes, because obviously not a lot of people have VR headsets yet. So, but it is, the VR episodes are integrated of the series. So they're not just like a one-off promotion for the series. So I think
it's not just a marketing thing that sits outside of it. It's not like the Martian
Yeah.
VR experience or what
Yeah.
Mr. Robot did.
Yeah, so that said, though, they're two totally different production processes. So for linear, we went about shooting a regular, like regular live action shoot. And for VR, we used some of the elements, like we recreated one of the rooms that we shot in, but it's really using like game engine technology. And so, there really are two
what game
totally-
engine technology did you use?
Unity.
You used Unity. Okay. All right. So you used Unity to recreate digitally or virtually that space, and then use that to populate some of the
Some of the assets. But everything really has to be almost recreated. We did do some motion capture with the actors. We use voiceover with the actors because in VR there aren't using game engine. There aren't a lot of ways that you can have interactivity without using. Like you can't go and shoot an actor and then expect them to look like photoreal in a Unity game engine. So there are lots of challenges. It's like producing two different series, but you have to find ways to make them match together.
Interesting. Now, from the director's standpoint, you are working with the mad scientist Stefan and trying to figure out how to create a narrative through line.
Right, yeah.
And then how to get that onto two different kinds of screens.
Yeah, which is, Sabrina was kind of touching on this, but one of the marching orders that we got from Sci-Fi when we were developing the series, and Sci-Fi was a wonderful partner. I loved working with them. We have nothing but
You'd love to
good
work
things
with
say.
them in the U.S., for instance.
Yeah, well, yeah. But,
Just throwing that out there.
But one of the things that Sci-Fi was very serious about, because a lot of the linear episodes were going to broadcast in different territories, and some people were only going to see the linear, they were like, guys, we're so excited about the VR. We want to make sure that the VR is really essential to the story, but we want to make sure that if you don't see the VR, you still totally get what's going on.
So essential, but not completely essential.
Exactly, yeah. So it was...
It's like my life with most women I've dated, so...
Well... No comment.
Yeah, well, it's probably the best.
But it's probably true for me as well. So it was tough to, just from a narrative standpoint, any screenwriters who are out there, as soon as you hear, I want you to write me a scene that is absolutely essential to the plot, but you can forget about it if you need to, it's like, well, that's impossible, right?
So did you learn any tricks in this process?
Well, you started to get really, really good at casual exposition and trying to bury that inside of a scene. So
That's a new
catch
phrase,
people.
casual exposition.
Yeah, casual
Write this
exposition.
down, screenwriting
Right.
students. So this is great.
So you kind of started to figure that stuff out. But the real thing that it teaches you, if you want to get really deep into it, is that like story structure is story structure,
Right.
and there's a reason why you don't repeat beats as you go across things, right?
Right.
But you started to learn how to do it in the most sneaky and undetectable way possible. Sometimes we were more successful at that than others.
Can you give an example, for instance, where you were sneakily successful? Or
I would
successfully
say,
sneaky?
it's the same with any like good exposition. Like if you can make the scene about something else, an emotional conversation where like naturally they're going to bring up details of the case to discuss what's going on, as long as it feels like it's believable within the context of the scene, and the scene is about something else and not just about, hey, let's recap information for the audience, then it can play off. Like we've got one scene where we've got our two detectives having lunch together, and really the scene is about them connecting on an emotional level about some stuff that's been going on between the two of them. But over the course of that, it makes sense to call up some facts from the case itself that were embedded in the VR episode. So that's a way where we can kind of get it out in a way where, if you know screenwriting, you know what we're doing, right? But if you're just watching the episode, it kind of flows. Some of the moments that are maybe less successful are scenes where it is really just an exposition scene, right? It really is just repeating information that an audience that has seen everything already knows, right?
Okay. So it's sort of an interesting and calculated bet, because you're doing this cool thing that gives you extra visibility, and of course gives you the opportunity to speak in front of this brilliant crowd at Digital Hollywood on the main stage. But it feels like it's still kind of a two-headed monster that requires a lot of wrangling.
It did, but it was, and Steph, I'm sure, would say the same thing. Like, it's exactly the kind of monster that we want to be wrangling right now in trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between traditional entertainment, which is very passive. You're sitting on the couch or you're in a theater and you're watching a story happen in front of you, versus video games or now VR, which is active. You're not watching it, you're living it. And so it was a really, really worthy, exposition aside, what was really interesting was trying to bridge this gap between a passive audience and an active audience. And there was a ton of really interesting narrative questions that arose because of that. Because it's like I'm watching the TV, I never think about who I am when I'm watching a show on the TV, right? In relation to the narrative, I'm just watching it. But as soon as we drop you into a scene, now we start having to answer questions about the audience, right? Who is the audience? Are they a character? Are they playing one of our main characters? Are they playing somebody else? Should we never address the audience and pretend that they're not there, pretend that they're a ghost? The path that we wound up taking was kind of this middle ground of addressing them but never assigning a character, so we never overwrote whatever the audience is kind of coming up with in their mind of how they're in the scene. But we do end up addressing you, but again, in a very casual way, right?
So, real quickly, each linear episode is about how long? Is it 22 or 44? Or?
Well, so the entire experience, all told, end to end, is about an hour long. So it's about the size of a pilot, with all 10 episodes and all 5 episodes.
With commercials.
Yeah, with commercials.
So it's an hour with commercials.
Yeah.
So it's only about 12 minutes, is what you're saying.
It's like each episode runs from 2 to 5 minutes. What we did find is that the shorter ones were better. Like, the network wanted shorter, and it's always better to have something a bit shorter when you have a massive headset on your head. So yeah, we anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. Some episodes we needed to be longer because they need to, like,
tell a story.
Expose all these plot things. But yeah, it's one thing that was really challenging is to tell a story in small episodic chunks.
The original conceit was to shoot an hour-long pilot that could also be chopped up into smaller.
Yeah, so there are companies that have done that with linear stuff for years, where they create it in a way that they can chop it up and sell it overseas as
Short form.
10 5-minute episodics with ads, or a whole hour long, or whatever.
Yeah.
So you took that kind of thought to this. It could be, I don't know how you do it with the two different kinds of media involved, but it's that same sort of thing, I guess, right?
Yeah, with 80 countries, there are literally so many different needs, and so there are lots of countries that are broadcasting it back to back. And then there are other countries that are just plugging it in as interstitials. Yeah.
This is interesting too, so to think about. Now, have you been involved in this some, Eric, in terms of the overseas distribution?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? So like you said, so sometimes, I mean, because in some ways, I mean, you can binge watch this show and then you kind of ignore the 5 VR parts that build a deeper feeling.
Yeah.
You can go full Netflix on it. I'm sort of curious how this plays out in various countries.
And it sort of starts with the fact that a lot of international countries or networks, broadcasters, broadcast American formats of 22 and 44 minutes.
Right.
And so but legally they can't broadcast.
They're state-owned or whatever. They're nonprofit.
Yeah, they can't broadcast.
They're like the
much
Beeb or
filler
whatever. Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah.
So they end up with these like 6-minute gaps that they need to fill content, and traditionally they use that to broadcast music videos or promos. And so the ask was, can we come up with an hour-long pilot that could also live as interstitial material?
Okay.
In those.
And it's a way of like trying out that content, because it would like run with bigger shows at the end, and then that sort of gives people a look in at VR, you know?
Okay, so it's like the reverse of the cartoon at the start of an old-time movie or whatever, so that kind of thing. So that affected the way you structure this as well. You all, that's what NBC's vision was to begin with, or?
That was the opportunity.
That was the opportunity.
It's sort of a backdoor pilot. Can we do an interstitial show that could also get collapsed into an hour-long pilot?
Interesting. So you guys were shoehorning things in all kinds of ways. I mean, it must have been, I would think that the biggest challenge, or actually it feels like there's a lot of big challenges on this one, but one of the biggest is just trying to write the damn thing and deal with the fact that it's on multiple. Just writing it. I mean.
Yeah, The fun thing about all of this like new emerging media right now is that you're always doing something for literally the first time anywhere. Like there's no, you're doing it for the first time and nobody else has done it either. So yeah, there was a big challenge. It's one thing to have to like write in and out of act breaks on a 1 hour. It's another thing to suddenly have, okay, now you don't just have like 3 or 5 acts, now you have 10 acts essentially, because we have to like get these hard outs at different points. So you have to get really good at scene structure. You have to get good at concise delivery. It was a challenge. It was certainly a challenge.
Interesting. Now, Sabrina, you were as supervising producer. Were you writing honcho on the VR production? And that's a different crew of folks, right?
I was supervising both, but it really is a different crew of folks. There was a producer for the linear portions, and there was a separate producer for the VR.
And give me an idea of the size of the teams on each side.
Oh, well, there's, lots. That's a really tough question. I'll have to go and count them all up. But
well, I mean,
I just like
on the
roughly
linear
like
side,
5,000, 4.
It's a regular shoot crew on the linear side.
Linear side, it was like about as big a crew as you would get on an indie feature in LA. So at any point, we had at the low end, we would have maybe 20 people on set. At the high end, we would get up to around 50 bodies, depending on what we were doing. And then, on the VR.
Yeah, it's like 20, 30, like there are lots of different jobs. Like for example, the audio, like there's an audio person who does like, who writes songs, and then there's like an audio person in Unity who prepares those songs for the developers to then put them into the game engine.
So one of the things you can do obviously in VR is have audio that's volume driven,
really
volumetric,
important.
I guess is the term, but it's in space, and so one of the ways you can direct is with the audio. I mean, that's a big way to direct is audio cues, so that's really important. So you had somebody doing music to do some of that, but
and then a whole sound team. Yeah, I think we had probably about 20, 25 people on the VR side. Using freelancers as well, and sometimes actually it could probably even be higher because some of the people that we hired have their own staff.
So they're the point person on a team of 5 or something like that.
Well, and we were talking about this a little bit before when we were sitting outside, the interesting collision that's happening right now between tech and game modes of work and filmmaking or television modes of work, right? And with the sound especially, this is a really interesting thing. We've been having a lot of discussions with different sound designers here in LA who have been working with Dolby to try and figure out this problem of like, okay, well, how do you mix in VR, right? Because the mix for everybody who's like film and TV savvy, the mix is a really, really essential part of making a film or a television show. It's when you final it, it's when you determine the sound of the piece, and it's really, really important to have your entire creative team in one room, everybody able to hear things at the same time, have discussions about, turn this up, down, that sound is right, this one is wrong, right, bring the music in here, back it out here, and have those discussions in real time. When you're doing things in a game engine, it's much, much, much more challenging to have those kinds of conversations. So on Halcyon, we didn't execute on the solve that we have for the future, but with Dolby, we're working on a solution that uses Atmos to do this kind of like spatial audio in an actual mix stage on a room so that you can have that kind of like film finishing experience, but for virtual reality. And I think that things like that they sound boring, but solving those processes are what's going to enable us to get more deep, satisfying narratives into virtual reality once we start to lower the barriers to the creative side of things.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, as I mentioned to you guys in the back, I'm a big gamer, and one of the things that the game guys have figured out in the spaces that they're working with now is that the spatiality of sound and how you use that in surprising ways, even in on a console title on a TV screen that may not have 7.1 sound around it. I mean, so and it is such a remarkable difference when you've got good audio, when you've got attention to detail on that. I think it's so easy to forget that in a visual medium, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I teach at UCLA, and I actually had a class last night.
Sorry.
Where sorry, but last night
that was for you, Rick Hack.
We were talking about sound, and it's such a huge thing. Like, sound is the only physical part of our medium right now. It's the thing that, like, it actually touches your eardrums and it makes things real. Like, when you have the right sound for something, it suddenly makes it tangible in a way that just seeing it doesn't. And especially in VR, as we are in this like limited capacity, having amazing sound design is often the difference between an okay project and a fucking awesome one. Sorry, and a really awesome.
That's actually that's the technical term. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah,
so.
that's that is the technical term.
FA project. Sabrina, so Ben mentioned just a little bit about the difference in cultures. What did that manifest for you as a supervising producer, dealing with those different cultures and senses of expectation and all that? Did that affect you in some ways? Were there any surprises for you?
I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, I've been worked in digital media for a long time, so I'm constantly going up against the challenges of people who aren't used to producing for digital media. I think like we went into the script, I think like we learned a lot with the script writing. We went in thinking that the episodes were going to be a lot longer. But they were much better shorter. But I think like it depends on what type of VR you're doing as well, right? So if you're doing 360 video, like talking about sound, for example, a sound can actually be like the only way to advance the plot because it might make you turn around.
Right.
And like Ben can probably speak more to this about it's almost like directing for theater or producing for theater. Because,
well, that's what I wanted to get to, because
Yeah.
last spring I did a somewhat similar panel with the guys, Randall Kleiser and some of those guys who were involved in Kleiser's project Defrost. And they were talking about it, and Randall had just directed a theater play before he did Defrost, and he said, it's like theater in the round, but inverted, because instead of the audience being around you, you're around the audience.
Yep.
It's Sleep No More, immersive theater experiences. That's a really good comp. We're actually working on a script for a project we're really excited about right now, and that's one of the things we're looking at in the script right now is like there's some language that is so easy to put on the page, and it works 100% if you're doing film or TV, like you're implying a close-up or you're implying some kind of editorial strategy, which you can't do that depending on the type of VR that you're doing, and you really do have to start thinking about it like a stage play, but like a stage play that the audience is standing in the middle of, right? So simple concepts like, an insert. Getting an insert in VR is really tough unless you can engineer the blocking or engineer the world to create that insert for you, right? It's not as simple as just cutting to, the thumb drive that somebody is holding.
Yeah, we were talking about shooting with babies and dogs. Like that's kind of out the window.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that would have been a little bit ambitious.
Yeah, well, we've got a
guess.
script right now with a baby and a dog. I don't know what we're
We'll
gonna
see if you
do.
survive that. Yeah.
And I think another big thing is that I will tell anyone who's thinking of producing for VR is the different media, the different platforms, I should say. So like we put it out on Samsung Gear VR and Oculus Rift, and like they could not be more different. But we managed, with a lot of money, to port from Rift to Gear. So they're just all so different right now.
Are you going to put it on the PSVR?
Eric?
Eric?
The goal is to be as cross-platform as possible.
Yeah. I mean, that looks like that's going to be really big. I wrote something about this last week.
That would be my bet. I think PlayStation is the most monetizable of the platforms.
Yeah.
I think it is the most ready market particularly for this kind of project. So the goal would be to go out on PlayStation, but PlayStation presents some pretty big sort of budget and logistical challenges to port to.
Well, let's talk about that real quickly if we could, because I agree with you, it is the most monetizable in terms of the fact they've got 40 million PS4s out there in the world, and you can plug and play for $400. And they've already got linear video distribution with their skinny bundle and their apps and all that. It would seem to be a pretty obvious opportunity to do that sort of cross-platform in a very painless way. But what are the logistical and budget challenges there?
The principal one, and there's some flexibility in this, is that any level of software development, and this definitely qualifies, a large portion of it is done using third-party plugins. It's just the way
to translate the stuff into their platform.
Yeah, well, just in general, there's shortcuts you use and code snippets you use to do any sort of animation or software development. And PlayStation is very locked down in terms of the third-party plugins it allows. So then you end up having to rebuild or rewrite a lot of those third-party plugins, which
they would or you would? You would.
They would force you to.
They would force you to. Okay.
And they do have a library of replacement plugins, and so it's a little bit of a gray area. But in general, you're probably another 50% on your budget just to port to PlayStation.
50%.
Yeah.
For the
On your
5
software development.
for your 5 episodes.
Yeah.
So that's not inconsequential. But that's part of the way they control and ensure that's a perfect platform for the things that they do.
It's
and
their
all that.
QA process, basically.
Right.
They just want to make sure it's bulletproof. It has to run in all of the territories they're in. It has to run
Right.
on a number of different TVs, headsets.
Right.
You know, it's a
Right.
very sort of like practical way to ensure quality on their part.
Right. It's a Procrustean bed, so though you've got to get cut to fit. Interesting. So it's an opportunity for not just you, but many others out there. But it's certainly something to think about as you're doing it. I'm just sort of curious to compare between, as you say, Samsung VR and Oculus Rift. Those are kind of the poles, right? I mean, that's the more or less the most expensive and involved and completely immersive versus what's essentially 360 video, or half a step beyond that. So, if you were doing this project starting today, would you structure it differently in terms of being able to have the PSVR in there and build it so that it would work there as well as the other guys? I mean, what would that mean?
Yeah, well, I think we'd budget it with that in mind up front. We weren't this was supposed to launch, many months ago originally. So,
Yeah, when did you guys start this?
we shot in January.
Yeah, we started applying for funds though, like the year prior.
Sometime in 2015.
Yeah, so, and then, yeah, I would definitely say, like, anything can happen, right? Like, phones are now catching on fire. And, like, yeah, and so it's just, like, you just never, like, PSVR is supposed to be the next hottest thing. I would definitely gear you towards that, like, if you're going to be producing, but, yeah, I think, like, you just never know. It's like, if you can get it done as quickly as possible, like, have, kind of like Steph said, like, do what is manageable to get it out quickly.
Because when we started working on this, a few of us in the office thought that room scale or the Oculus Touch controllers would be the greatest way to interact with the stuff in the world. But that was one of the first things where we said, we don't even know if they're going to be released in time. So, what's the point in developing for it and then it not being there when you launch? So it's something that we sort of kept in mind when we moved forward, and we sort of like thought, let's build this as if we were going to build it for room scale for like an HTC Vive or even just standing room only for Oculus and PSVR, and then put it out on a platform that we know we can handle, put it on the devices that we know people are going to have in their hands, and then we can always come back to it and move it further.
Rebuild it or whatever.
There was also kind of a strategic component because Oculus, when we kicked this off, Oculus was going to launch first, and we were looking for a platform partner on it, and Oculus seemed to make the most sense, and they've been a great partner.
Did they chip in some money?
It was promotion.
Yeah, promotion.
They're really good with promotion, which is equals that.
Which is helpful.
Yeah.
So is it available in this country on Oculus? No.
Nope.
Not yet.
International only.
Not yet,
So
yeah.
any of you
So
flying
it's
to France
geofenced
tonight,
in some way or something like that?
Yep.
So all my Tor client thing.
Yeah. Spoofing IP. You can
Spoofing
go-
IP. Me and Snowden.
The big difference between Rift and Gear for this project was like compressing of assets, compressing everything down, and that just took forever, but it was worth it. It ended up looking almost
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about platforms for a while, but that platforms is probably the biggest frustration with doing anything in VR at the moment. It's just, Eric says this all the time, it's like the worst version of VHS versus beta right now, where it's so diffuse, but the expectation and the desire from creators is to try and get it in front of as many people as possible, but for so many different reasons, it's difficult to do that. And to your question of like, would we do it differently right now? Well, yes, definitely. But that's the case with any project because the landscape is evolving so quickly. If we started a project today versus 2 weeks from now, we would have a different game plan, because you just have to be responsive to the climate that exists.
And the creative itself would adapt because we sort of went into it with a certain level of auspices or limitations or things we could play with within the medium, but now with PlayStation and Move controllers, we'd have a whole different set of limitations. Like, the version of Halcyon right now isn't truly room scale. It's more positional track, seated experience. But with a Move or touch controllers or a Vive, you can go full room scale. And so maybe we would just skip straight to that now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for all the folks out here who are thinking about actually creating, it sounds like, we've got a lead time here. I mean, the fact that you turn this around, even in the short period of time you did, we saw 5 different platforms or 6 platforms launch or fully get out there.
Yeah.
And we still got Magic Leap capering in the, in the hidden woods back there. And some other
Daydream
folks.
launching later.
Yeah, whatever Daydream's going to be. I know they had a big announcement, and they just had Leco announce its Samsung VR competitor earlier this week. So, yeah, you're right. Even 2 weeks from today, it could be different. From a creative standpoint, do the platforms dramatically affect the content?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
So give me some
yeah.
examples of how that shapes what you're actually putting on the screen.
Okay, so Steph, I know, has good answers to this.
Steph, go for it.
So there's a few different ways to think about it, but in the basic sense, you've got, okay, how can your audience interact with it? Is it a Gear VR where they have one button and they can look around? Is it Daydream where you've got one control? Is it, what the Rift was until they announced touch, just using an Xbox controller? Or is it the Vive where you've got room scale and you've got your hands, right? So that's a huge creative consideration in terms of how is the audience going to interact with your world, right? But then behind that, you have how powerful is the computer that's running it, right? Is it a PlayStation 4, a telephone, or a networked Cray computer that's got all of this stuff? I guess a Cray.
You said Cray.
Yeah.
You are older than you look.
Yeah,
wow. It's been a while since
I was thinking of
it's
Jurassic
Cray.
Park.
You mentioned Cray. I'm just saying.
Right, that's right.
I mean, even like PlayStation is, even though it's the newest one out and it's probably the most monetizable, it's 6-year-old hardware.
Yeah.
Like it's
No, it's 3-year-old. Well, you're right. I mean, they started making those chips 6 years ago. You're
they've
right.
been
And
updating
they're
it.
going to have the new boxes out with 2-year-old hardware. But your point's
but it's-
taken. Yeah.
It's a very challenging hardware set to develop with.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, that plays into your creative considerations too, when you're thinking about fidelity, what's our visual style going to be, how stylized versus how photoreal is it going to be, how many characters can we have on screen, if you're shooting something in the real world, a film, the easiest thing in the world, as long as you have a stocked grip truck, is let's set up a light. We need a light in that corner, let's set up a light, right? But as soon as you start working in something where you're in Unity or Unreal, adding a light is like, oh, okay, wait, we're adding a lighting effect. Does that mean we have to dial down the complexity of this character model in the scene? Does that mean that this scripting has to be
Because
scaled
it
down?
adds a whole bunch more pixels.
Totally.
Light information has to be dealt with.
So it's, there's a lot of considerations, yeah.
Fascinating. Okay. So going forward, everything's geofenced. You all saw 3 minutes more of this show than everybody else in America, except the people down the highway at Universal, I guess. What can you say about it coming to the U.S., and what structure might it look like if it came here?
The current version, we're trying to figure out what I can't say too much, but this version will make it to the States here in the short term. We hope, we think, crossing fingers. Okay. But the bigger goal, and this has always been the bigger goal, was that this is sort of the pilot or the test version of it. The goal is to spin it up into a full broadcast series.
Now, do you all see this also, because it seems to like it would be good for this, more spin-off, either location-based VR stuff or more of a game space thing as well, beyond the connection to the linear show? I mean, once you've got the panel I handled on Tuesday was about building sustainable franchises out of entertainment properties. Well, you've got something that could be that. Is that part of your all's long-term vision from a creative and business standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. It's some version of that. I mean, there's been a lot of conversations about how this lives as a traditional TV show or traditional franchise. Right now, in its current conceit or current format, it very clearly volleys from VR to traditional and back and forth to tell a complete story. But when you're watching, when you're doing appointment TV or every Sunday night broadcast, you can't quite.
What is this term you're talking about?
Appointment television.
Appointment TV. I'm
not
not familiar with
when
that.
When you're on traditional broadcast, you can't expect after the 9 p.m. broadcast for them to go put their headset on. I mean,
Right.
That sort of one-to-one sort of connection is somewhat lost, and so I guess the current philosophy is the VR needs to kind of tell a parallel story, and it can be impacted by the linear, but it's not necessarily a one-for-one in terms of.
It's a little bit of a throwback to, I think, what was it, years ago there was an award-winning online site tied to the show Homicide, Life in the Streets, and so they had a separate set of stuff on the web that connected into the brand and did stuff, but it sort of sat in its own way. This one, though, seems more directly integrated than that. But you're saying if we were doing this for 5 seasons on Sci-Fi, for instance, in the U.S., and those are hour-long episodes, the VR part would be other things going on in the building or something.
I mean, some of the, like a persistent world is one version we've talked about, which would be, I don't know if you're much of a gamer, but it's MMO.
I'm a big gamer.
It'd be something you can log in, log out of at
Right.
any time, any day, that you want to, and just live.
And there's stuff going on while you're not there.
Yeah, and live in the world, virtually live in the world of Halcyon.
Right.
And we actually have a number of properties we're doing this with, a number of traditional TV shows that we're looking to do persistent VR worlds around.
Now, are these on a consulting basis for somebody else, or stuff that you're trying to create on your own that you've got in development?
Stuff we're developing on our own.
Okay, all right. I think it's about time to take a couple of questions. I'd like you to, if you want to say something to these guys, stand up, tell us who you are, wave your arms, jump up and down. I will repeat the question for the benefit of our streaming audience, which is not geofenced but covers the world. And we will go from there. Does anybody have a question to ask of this very interesting panel? Anybody at all? Oh, in the front here. You, sir, stand up.
My name is Brian. I'm an immersive theater creator, and I know one of the biggest challenges that we have is making meaningful interactions that people can actually have. Because obviously you need to make it personalized, but you also need to make it so you can basically have the same similar interactions with like the same person coming through. So I was just curious what sort of interactions you guys found to be successful in this space, because I know certain video games like Heavy Rain or Beyond Two Souls have interactions where you can kind of change what characters do depending on how you interact. So
Yeah.
So the question is from Brian, the immersive theater guy. I think that's your official title. How do you essentially personalize the VR experience so that it is more specific to the individual person, or able to modify in some ways and branch off as they go through the experience? Is that fair?
Yeah, it seems like that was good. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, Steph and I have been talking about this a lot recently with some of the next projects that we're going to be getting off the ground. I mean, Steph, I know, has been doing a lot of work with kind of modular storytelling and sort of that kind of branching narrative, but making it a little bit less obtrusive, as opposed to like Heavy Rain, where you're actually selecting A or B, One we're working on right now that I'm really excited about is using AI to drive character behavior so that you can start to have a more natural and intuitive interaction with a non-human character in a scene. I think that like that kind of stuff is really, really satisfying, when it feels like you're having an impact on the world, but it's not an impact that's being presented to you in a choose your own adventure, like choose this or this, right? But it's more just like you're in the world and you're doing what you want to do and the world is responding to you and you're not really aware of the underlying choice tree that's happening.
We kind of did that on Halcyon. Like that was one of our biggest challenges, is no one wanted it to feel like a choose your own adventure. But then we actually did a first round of there are 2 detectives voiceovers in the VR. And the first round didn't really in any way make it feel like the user was included, and it was awful. Like we were
You're just in a boat floating along, right?
There's no reason for you to be there. But but rather than making it like, you go do this, it was like the two detectives speaking together saying, let's find the next clue or whatever. So it makes it feel like they're talking to each other, but that you can also be a part of it. So it was a really like subtle way of doing it.
And a part of that is like, and you can do different things. It depends on how much of a character you want to assign to the audience and how much you're telling somebody this is who you are versus how vague you're being and letting them just kind of fill in the gaps, right? And setting up scenarios where as little as possible you're like commanding or requiring somebody to do something to advance the story that they might not natively want to do. Because as soon as you start telling somebody like, you have to do this or you have to say that, and it's not what they would want to do in the scenario, they start to diverge from the character but also from the story. Like their suspension of disbelief really falls apart.
This is really interesting because it seems to me that you're getting at the heart of a challenge between the active and passive audience by having a dual project that assumes the same person can be both, and I think we can, but some are more one or the other. How far in do you presume that they need to be an active audience when they get in the VR space? That by donning the headset, that they have volunteered for the active army, right?
Yeah, no one wants to put that headset on to just sit there and do nothing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's an interesting conflict.
Obvious.
How do you balance that out? I mean, I think that's one of the essential things, it seems like, in thinking about this.
Well, I have been playing tabletop role-playing games like
Yes!
Dungeons & Dragons for a very long time. And in high school, I was heavily involved in improv theater. And at some point, and I have a huge talk just about this subject, and I could go on forever, but I won't.
You got to meet my son.
But my experience in improv has really influenced how I play Dungeons & Dragons, specifically how I run Dungeons & Dragons as a dungeon master. And what that means is rather than trying to be this author who is taking the players who are the protagonists through the story world that I've created, I try to create it at the table with them. Because it cuts down on my time to have to like pre-populate everything.
Right.
So I actually use a lot of improv techniques and techniques or systems like 5-act structure or the 36 dramatic situations, which are these sort of like codified situations in literature, to assign tags, I would call them, to different plot points, locations, and characters, and then have those sort of dynamically become important when the players approach them.
So not that different, really, than Brian, our immersive theater guy.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of immersive theater, a lot of improv that can get involved in when you start talking about the really active VR stuff. And that's where I'm really interested is, let's not just look at this as another screen medium where I'm going to be the author and I'm going to send you a story and you're going to experience it and that's it. We have to really redefine who the author is and who the audience is and what our roles are.
But I think, we are definitely assuming a very active audience. I think that like when we go into any of these projects, and it's still storytelling. You have to draw people into the world. You have to introduce them to characters, to the rules of the game. You can't like throw them immediately into something that requires a high degree of fluency with whatever your experience is. But I think we are assuming that the point we want to get to is an extremely active and engaged audience. I don't know if people are watching Westworld on HBO.
Yes, thank you.
But yeah, like I don't think that this is the reaction the show creators want people to have, but like I just want to make Westworld. Like I want to make Westworld and just like dive into that. Like that's
Somebody's doing it. They're doing it in a game mod.
Yeah, if
or
you take
500 game mods.
If you take the word robots from Westworld and replace them with virtual NPCs, you've got what I think VR entertainment is going to be in the future.
Right, yeah. Minus the dysfunctional, murderous part, possibly.
Yeah.
One can hope. We can hope. Another person here in the front. Stand up, bellow out your name.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Carr. I'm a film producer. Can I say it?
No, stand, talk.
Well, so I'm trying to wrap my head around. Have you assigned for the audience that is watching your VR, are they another detective, or sometimes are they watching the criminals? What thought went into your doing that? And is it that we are in the room with them, and that's the extent of the VR at this point?
So this, just to report, this is Elizabeth Carr, the producer and shy person, clearly not an actress also, who is asking, what is the role of the audience? The thing we touched on a little bit in the last question. What is that actual role that they have within the VR space?
Well, yeah, so because we didn't go to watch the video, I think the pitch of the show didn't come across very well, so I apologize for everyone being in the dark. But so the pitch
It turns out sound is really important, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. So the pitch of the show is near future, VR is ubiquitous, police now use virtual reality to solve violent crimes, right? So when there's a murder, they can recreate that crime scene in VR to investigate, look for clues, try and figure out who done it, basically. So in our show, every time our main characters go into their virtual crime scene, the audience then steps in, and they're now in charge of walking around the crime scene, finding these clues, and trying to put together the pieces. So that's the experience then. And, you know, exactly to what you're saying, like, who are you? This is, as Sabrina was saying, this was one of the big challenges when we were in production on this, is iterating through trying to answer that question. Because we had an idea initially of who you were, and when we first executed on it, as she was saying, it did not work at all. It really didn't work. So we went through processes of, okay, well, we're going to try creating a character that we assign to the audience. This is who you are. We're going to try and seed it, but that did not feel good for the reasons that I was talking about before. You're telling people too much about who they are, and it causes them to reject the experience. So instead, we tried to stake out this middle ground of making sure that we were acknowledging that you're there, but never really giving you any kind of specific command about who you were supposed to be. So it leaves it ideally in this space where if the audience is engaged enough, they come up with their own rationale for who they are. And so we've talked to different people who've experienced it, and some people will say, oh, I was a detective, or oh, I was a lab technician, or, you know, oh, I was like an AI assistant, right? But people want to fill in the gaps in your story natively, I think, and we're hoping that this is a satisfying gap to fill for them.
So think about improv theater, where a troupe gets on stage and one of them might say, we're now going to perform a scene in the style of a gothic horror. And then everybody on stage, all the other actors, they understand the conceits. They know what they're getting themselves into, right? And I think that's sort of the level of prescription that we want to give to the audience to help them decide who they are in the scene. So our first episode, which is linear, tells them about the world, and then when they get into the virtual space, they'll make up their own minds about who they are in that world.
So one sort of follow-up question that we've touched on a little bit through this. As fast-changing as this is, as different as the technologies are now from when you all were looking for money a year ago, we talked a little bit about this whole part about the role assigned to the audience member as a participant and how participant they are. What are the things going forward that you wouldn't do on the next project? What are the lessons learned for the next project?
Go for it.
What would we not do?
I have one.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a lot.
I think one thing is like the episodes feel almost too short. They needed to fit into a. They were
too long, and then now they're too short.
Well, they needed to fit in as interstitials. But if you were to do a VR series, I think you need some time to build the characters and build the plot, right. And it's almost impossible to do that in 2 minutes, sure. Right? So it's something to keep in mind when you're doing an actual series.
Yeah, and I mean, my response would be essentially the same thing, is this was a really great experiment. We are so proud of the end product. The thing that we loved the most about it was solving these questions of real audience agency. And so I think the thing going forward, we have a few different projects where we are doing this like hybrid approach, but as Eric was saying, we're starting to decouple those narratives so that when we're doing something like that, it's more like, and I'm going to put on my English major hat, but it's more like Hamlet versus Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, if you guys are familiar with that. So you've got characters in one story who are, you know, your foreground heroes, and then you've got background characters that you then flop in the other experience. So we're thinking of that more now as we're going forward with these hybrids to really try and preserve the integrity of each side. Like, it was really fun to do this back and forth, but I think the thing that we learned is that you want to be able to just like tell a story in the medium that you're telling the story.
So ping pong's tough.
Ping pong is tough. Ping pong is fun, but ping pong is tough.
All right, so the relay race is easier. All right, okay. Not to push my metaphor too far. I'm going to actually let somebody in the second row, and then we'll come back to you, but stand up.
Hi, my name is Alton Carswell. I'm a doctoral student in media psychology.
I got too many brainy people in this room. It's making me feel a little intimidated. He's talking Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. You're talking this. We got the world-building dude from USC running around. It's Christ.
One of the things I wanted to know that I was thinking of, because I'm really focused on how the media experience is affecting the audience. So since you're working with virtual reality, it seems like this audience is, or the community member is the fourth wall, and how you interact with them and how they change, they are going to be affected by the content that they're watching. So you've got things like new fans that are watching the show where they're coming in, or those fans that follow the show that goes past, hopefully 5 seasons, etc. Where they're going, so meeting them where they're at and how the content is changing them, and how you're going to write the story. So that's really interesting, because how are you gauging that?
So the question from the PhD doctoral student is, as he's preparing for his second doctorate and dissertation, is about how we're redefining the fourth wall. Is that fair to say in VR? And is that fourth wall, I mean, is the audience member embedded in it or inside it, or I mean, how does that affect and change the way we tell stories?
Well, I mean, I can go at it from the way that I'm understanding your question, at least, is, if you are telling these stories where the audience is much, much more engaged in the story itself, is having an impact on the story and being affected, how much is there a give and take between us, the creator, and the audience, right? And I think the nice thing about the culture that surrounds video games especially is that there, depending on the company, there is a fairly porous exchange between audience and creator, right? And so that's kind of natively built into the system. It's a balance that you have to strike, right? Because you don't want to let your audience dictate the flow of the story, because often your audience thinks they know what they want, but they don't actually know what they want,
Steve Jobs said that, I think. You don't know what you want till you actually have it.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's very true of storytelling. It's like, I know that we all want certain characters on Game of Thrones to survive. We want that, but we don't really want that. That's why we keep watching the show, because bad things happen sometimes, right? So you have to be delicate in this balance of respecting and understanding how people are responding and work that into the story that you're telling, as Steph is talking about with tabletop design, right? At the same time, it's like people are there for a story. They want to be entertained, they want to be thrilled, they want to have moments of despair as well as moments of joy. And so you can't always let them write the story, because everything's going to be nice all the time, but it's going to be boring. Potentially.
Okay. Great. And one last question. We are running over time, but you guys are all fascinating. So stand up. Tell us who you are. What, Wednesday? Stand up.
I'm on a little round camera anyway. Anyway, so my question is actually, can you talk about the casting process and also about whether or not it was improvisational or everything was actually accurately scripted prior to?
Wednesday asks on Thursday if the casting process was purely improvisational or highly scripted or somewhere in between.
Yeah. In this case, it was a scripted project through and through. The script changed, of course, a lot, and we worked on it in concert with the actors, but it was scripted. The casting process was very similar to casting for film or television, and we weren't necessarily... we weren't uptight about what people's prior experience had to be. I will say that it was interesting because of our two lead actresses, our two detectives are women, and our two lead actresses, one of them has a deep history with television work, and the other one is very much a theater actress. And in fact, this was the first time that she had done something on screen. So it was interesting to see between the two of them. One of them, the TV person, was very, very comfortable when we were shooting our linear portion, and the theater actress, there was a learning curve with her in realizing that all the tools that she's built up for telling a story in theater, are less important when what's most important in a close-up is what is your face doing and how are you feeling, right? So there was a learning curve there, but then that flopped once we got into the VR, and suddenly her skills with theater became much, much, much more valuable immediately than our television actresses, who was much more used to this kind of nonverbal communication style, that once we got into the VR world, there were fewer gains from that, right? So in terms of the casting, we're just looking for good actors, the right people who have the right spirit, right? But then once we started making the thing, people's skills did come to bear on how comfortable they were and how much they had to struggle.
Great. All right, this is all we have time for and a little bit more, so thank you all. Let's give a big hand for this panel.